Hi, I'm Margaret, and I'm making these big and bold vanilla custard slices today. The puff pastry is homemade, so let's start with that. So the first thing to do is to grate and freeze the butter. One way of doing this to make it a bit easier is to put 200 grams in one carton and 60 in another. Butter grates quite easily when it's cold from the fridge. I've put a bit of paper underneath, then it can come out of the carton without any sticking. Once the scales has reached 200, I'm going to separate it a little down the middle so it's easier to get out in two halves. And here's the 60 grams that's going to be rubbed into the flour. That can be frozen too. I'm being very particular today to keep everything really cold. I've even had this big bowl and the flour in the fridge before I started. Now here's that butter. You can see it's formed a bit of a solid lump, but it's very easy to break up. As it's frozen, it won't completely be rubbed into the flour. You won't get the fine breadcrumbs, and you'll still be able to see little bits of butter. But that's absolutely fine. That's just right for this kind of pastry. I'm going to add a teaspoonful of lemon juice here. This helps the gluten in the flour to become more elastic. There's a lot of folding and rolling in making puff pastry. Using strong plain flour helps here too, by making the pastry nice and flaky. The water I'm using is ice cold, and I'm just adding a little bit at a time. I don't want to add too much, just enough to bring it together. There, that will do. Now for the first of the rolls. We have to roll this pastry out 7 times in all, twice with butter in. So here we go. I've speeded up quite a few of these sections. You don't want to watch me rolling out pastry all day. You get cleaner folds if you try and keep it in a rectangle, or as near to a rectangle as you can. Now for the butter. It's beautifully frozen, and I can pick it up in one lump. I'm going to spread this a little bit, trying not to touch it too much, onto 2/3 of the pastry, leaving that little end, that 1/3 at the end, completely blank. Then that gets folded over, and the tricky bit is keeping the butter on while you fold over the last third. So you've now got a sandwich, a double sandwich, with 2 layers of butter in. Turn it 90 degrees and roll it out again. This time I'm going to fold it without the butter in, but it's making another fold so that we're getting more layers. We're building them up as we go along. Now, just as I said at the beginning, this pastry needs to be kept cold, and with working it like this, it does warm up. So I'm going to pop it into the fridge for an hour just to get it cold again. The butter will be nice and firm inside this pastry again now. And I'm going to repeat what I did before. 1 fold with butter and 1 without. I must remember to turn it 90 degrees before I roll it. That keeps the layers even. Now for that fold without the butter in. There we go. Now it needs rolling and folding 3 more times. This makes a total of 7 rolls and 7 folds. Now after this fold, I noticed the pastry was getting soft again. If this happens, it has to be wrapped up and popped back in the fridge for an hour. After that time, it's ready for the final rolls and folds. Now, to be honestly truthful with you, you can do this with shop-bought pastry. It's not quite as nice as homemade, but it will do the job. This is fold number 6. And here's the final one. And then, you guessed it, back into the fridge again to cool down. So let's butter and line a couple of baking tins and pop some baking paper on top. I'll give you a closer look at that pastry. You can see the layers. There's the little dots of butter in the pastry. It's that butter that melts in the oven and lets air get in so that we get lots of lovely layers. Let's work with half at a time. You can see how it's folded here. There's the layers. The next stage is to make 2 rectangles that will fit on your baking trays. They'll need to be the same size and about 3 millimeters in thickness. Mine were 26 centimeters by 18, but it will depend on what size your trays are. If you have a rectangular baking tin with a loose bottom, you could use that and measure your rectangle to fit exactly. And by the way, the bits you cut off to make it the right size, don't throw them away. You can put them straight into a baking tin, sprinkle icing sugar on them, and they make a delicious tasty snack when they're baked. When you've got the size you want, it's ready to go in the baking tin. Now for this recipe, we don't want the puff pastry to rise too much. We want the layers, but we want it to remain quite thin. So I've floured a fork so it doesn't stick, and I'm poking lots of holes all over. The sifted icing sugar will give it a lovely caramelised top. A piece of baking paper and a second tray on top will weigh it down a little bit too, and stop it from rising too much. So there we go, beautifully golden brown. Don't forget to do the second one, we'll need 2 pieces. It's cool enough to handle now, so I'm going to pop it on the cooling rack to cool completely. It's time now to make the custard. These 3 ingredients now need to be heated up on the stove. It's best not to get them too hot. Don't let them boil. They just need to be heated through until the liquid starts to steam. And while that's happening, let's mix the rest of the ingredients together in a large bowl. I always think using the really yellow eggs makes a difference when you make custard. It gives it such a lovely rich colour. Both the corn flour and the eggs help the custard to thicken. And let's give it a good few drops of vanilla extract. They are vanilla slices after all. This now needs mixing to form a paste. I'm going to pour this now onto the paste, but I've got to do it little by little. If I put it all in at once, I'm going to cook those eggs and I'll end up with scrambled eggs. So little by little, just so that the mixture heats up slowly. And once you've got enough of the milk mixture in, carefully stir in the rest. This can now go back into the pan and back onto the heat. It can go on to medium, so it heats up slowly, and once it comes to a boil it for about a minute and then off the heat and pop the whole pan into cold water. Give it a good stir so a skin doesn't form. This will help cool it down as well. It will be ready to use when it's nearly at room temperature again. While that's cooling, I'm going to keep stirring it every now and again, but let's start making that icing. And it truly couldn't be any easier. Just pop enough lemon juice into the icing sugar so that it makes a nice runny paste. Into an icing bag with it. Twist the top and it's ready to use. I'm going to make a bit of a foil boundary. The custard is very thick and it will probably stay between the 2 layers of pastry, but just to make sure, I'm going to put this around the pastry to hold the custard in place. Okay, let's neaten up those edges. Now this one's going to be the top, so I'm going to cut this into slices, or maybe little squares. This way it'll be easier to cut individual pieces when the custard's set. Finally, it's time to build. Bottom piece goes upside down, and here's the little frame I made earlier. On with the custard, which has cooled and has thickened up beautifully. I'll just smooth it over a bit so it's nice and neat. Right into those edges. On with the top layer. That last bit's a bit tricky. There we go. That's better. Traditional vanilla slices have icing smoothed all over the top, but this lovely top looks so golden brown. I didn't want to waste it, I wanted it to show. So I decided to do some little squiggles instead, so it peeked through. These little sliced almonds have been browned in a pan just ever so quickly for a few seconds. It gives them a lovely toasty flavour, and they look quite pretty on top. This needs to be left in the fridge now. Overnight's best, but for at least 6 hours. And the only thing left to do now is to slice it up. I can see some little bits of custard just extra over the edge of each slice. I'll have to trim that off. That'll have to be the cook's treat. I do hope you've enjoyed watching today. Thanks so much for joining me. Catch you very soon.